Okay, Alexander, let's talk about what's going on in France. Macron, Barnier, Zemmour, Le Pen, elections coming up in less than a year's time. And the French economy, which it looks like Macron is up to some funny business there as well. Not good. Not good on all fronts, but what's the situation in France right now?
I have to say, I think overall it's extremely sad, actually, because of course there's an election coming up in France. The country is demoralised and in a bad way, but there doesn't seem to be any real sense or feeling that anything very much is going to come. Now, we've had this phenomenon in recent months of Eric Zemmour, who is a well-known, very well-known journalist in France, and he's come forward and he's been saying the various things that Marine Le Pen used to say, but has given up saying, and he's taken an awful lot of support from her, and he's been rising in the polls, and he's overtaken her, and at the moment I think he's second in the polls behind Macron. But he's second in the polls only at 15%, and I'm getting the sense that he might have peaked. So it's beginning to look unlikely that Eric Zemmour will in fact form a real convincing challenge to Macron, who's standing for re-election. Le Pen, in the meantime, looks increasingly weak and discredited. As I said, she threw away her very strong political position. It's looking extremely difficult to see how she can find a way back. Macron himself is at 24%, and that gives you an idea of how demoralised the situation is in France, because you would expect the President of the Republic to be polling much better than that and to be widely supported across France. But the reality is that the French people have little time and very little sympathy for Macron, who has managed to annoy and irritate virtually everybody and is held in very little respect by most of the French people. And yet Macron looks at the moment like the likely winner, because the alternatives to him are so weak. As I said, Zemmour has peaked, Le Pen has become discredited, and what we have instead, increasingly, is this effort to build up this former Eurocrat, Michel Barnier, who was the person who led the EU in the negotiations with the British over Brexit, and who is known to have been an extremely hardline negotiator. There's now this attempt to build him up and to pretend that he's suddenly become a Eurosceptic, something which no one in France, I think, takes seriously. And given that this lineup is so weak, it's very difficult to see how any of these people can challenge Macron. So there is demoralisation, there's dissatisfaction, there's little support for Macron himself. He seems to be drifting towards a victory, which he's most likely to win by default. But it gets worse, because what Macron has been doing in order to secure that victory is that he's taken a leaf from the master's book, if you can call him that, the master being in this case Joe Biden, and he's been spending money in France like there's no tomorrow. He's gone ahead with a massive spending program. He's been writing checks in all directions, giving financial subsidies to all sorts of people. He's been doing everything he can to win support by basically buying support. He's imposed a freeze, a cap on gas prices, which is, of course, extremely expensive. All of this at a time when France's debt levels have been rising. They're now roughly at 115% of GDP. I'm talking about state debt. And when the deficit, France's deficit, its structural deficit, that's to say, its deficit once you strip out all the pandemic spending, is now at 5% of GDP, which is well above the 3% of GDP level that is allowed by the Eurozone criteria. And all the indications are that structural deficit, instead of reducing, is actually going to grow. So Macron is spending his way to victory, against a weak opposition in a way that's going to undermine the French economy long term even more. And at the moment, opinion in France, the people of France, seem so demoralized and so dejected that they don't really seem to know how to respond to this, whom to rally around, how to organise. There's no sign of protests on the streets of any significance. It's unfortunately a story of a great nation that seems to be going downhill at an accelerating rate, with nobody really having any idea of how to turn it round.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's protests, but it's the yellow vests who are out, and it's people
Yeah,
protesting
yeah,
the Macron coup mandates. So, I mean,
yes,
you have the
yeah,
big protests have nothing to do with what's going on with the
no,
elections
no,
and stuff like that,
no,
and people
no,
are absorbed with, and rightly so, they're absorbed with Macron's tyranny, his
yes,
tyranny. But
yeah,
it sounds like everything's been deliberately diluted. So you've
yes,
thrown a lot of people in the mix, and the one person takes from the other. Le Pen, she's to blame fully for her demise because she decided to water down her platform, and she should take full responsibility for the fact that she had the opportunity to become president and she screwed it up. And
absolutely.
Zemmour takes away from Le Pen. Barnier comes in and he, muddies the water as well, and some other candidates. So it looks like everything's been diluted. At the end of the day,
Yes.
you're going to probably end up with a runoff between Barnier and Macron. So, it's the globalists and the EU kind of win either way,
Absolutely, absolutely,
if that's the scenario.
absolutely. As that is the scenario. I mean, it's that French expression: "Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose." The more things change, the more they remain the same. Or, if you prefer an even more cynical view, which is the one that that was quoted by that Italian novelist, the Prince of Lampedusa, that everything must change so that it can remain the same. You change everybody round. You create sort of appearance of politics, but the reality is the power remains exactly as it was, and there is no real movement, nothing. Now, I have to say this also. I mean, one of the things about all of this is that Macron, I think, still fantasizes that if he's re-elected in April, he's going to be this incredibly strong leader who's going to lead the EU with Merkel gone, and he's going to lead the EU forward into the ever closer union of his dreams, and there's going to be an EU army, and he will be the Napoleon at the head of it. I think that is what Macron still thinks at some level. The reality is, all of those things might happen. There might very well be ever closer union. There might even be an EU army, but it will not be France that will lead it. It will be Germany, or at least the German political establishment, which itself, by the way, is in a very decayed state. But bad though the situation is in Germany, and I think people underestimate how bad it is now much worse in France. So we're seeing every part of this system weaken and corrode. And you're quite right in saying that there are plenty of protests, but without a political centre, without an organising force that can take power, lead the country, provide a leadership from the Elysee, that can form a policy that can take the country forward. I mean, all those protests are simply protests going round in a circle. They reflect the very real anger that there is in France, the very real sense of disaffection that there is in France, the sense that many French people have that their country is, as you said, going down the tubes. But they don't actually result in anything. They don't produce anything in the end in a political way. And that is a great tragedy, because I think a lot of people had been looking to France as the country that might finally make the big break. And I have to say, at this moment in time, it doesn't look very likely.
No, I mean, people are protesting just their ability to grab a coffee or go to the supermarket at this point. So, I mean, it's understandable. Absolutely. I'm with them. But, Macron or Bernier is just going to kind of drift into into the presidency. That's how it's going to be. And either one of them is weak, whether it's Macron or Barnier. They're going to be weak, and of course it's going to be all about the EU centralization. You're going to have a weak Germany as well, or whatever leaders do arise in Germany once Merkel is gone, which I think she has left, by the way. It doesn't matter who it is in Germany that takes over. You're looking once again at very weak leadership. At the end of the day, you don't really have any leadership in Europe. And you know what that means for me? It means that it's the perfect time for some sort of strong EU leader or EU committee to take over, an EU Politburo, an EU leader to take over and say, look, there's weakness everywhere. I'm your guy, or we're your people, and we're going to run the show for everybody.
Well,
that's where it looks like it's being set up to go.
Well, I think that's probably right. But as I said, there is no Politburo at the moment in Brussels. At least if it is, it's led by people like Ursula von der Leyen, who are hardly in a position. I mean, but no. Fundamentally, I agree with you. What has happened is that France has been weakened even more. This election campaign is going to weaken France still more. It's going to weaken the already weakening structure of the French economy, saddle it with more debt, saddle it with more regulation, saddle it with more problems in order to get either Macron or some other establishment figure across the line. And then, of course, they will try to lead an EU, which they will find that they lack the political and economic strength to do, because France's strength has been weakened.
That's the point, though, isn't it? I mean, I think that's the general point of all of this is everything becomes weak.
Yes.
Even Germany and France. Before it was, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. Before it was to make those country weaks the periphery. Okay, that's fine. But now it's just all about, you know what? We've hollowed out the periphery. Now let's take care of the core. Let's weaken that out, and everything goes to the center. And people are going to be manipulated to think, well, where else can we go but to the center? Because everyone else around us just absolutely sucks. So we have to go to the center.
I totally agree with that. I mean, as I've said many times on many programs, the thing always to understand about the EU is that it doesn't want strong governments and strong leaders in the national states. I mean, that is exactly what it wants to avoid. It wants weak leaders and weak governments in the states, because that way the centre can be strong. And this is playing out exactly as the EU centre wants it, except, of course, that the EU centre itself, it only looks strong by comparison with the states whose governments are in reality now so weak. So instead of getting a strengthening across Europe, you're getting a weakening across Europe, even as that happens alongside greater centralization.
All right, we'll leave it there. Go to the Duran.locals.com, go to the Duran shop, 10% off, use the code REALNEWS, and look for us on Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and Super U. You'll find all those links down below. Take care.